Jonathan Katz-Moses, and today we're going to talk about routing. Routers are one of the most versatile tools in the shop. They really can be used for so many different purposes. Today, I wanted to talk about some tips and tricks, as well as sort of some beginner skills and expert techniques that are going to help you get the most out of them. I recently did a video where we built this ultimate router jig here. That video will be linked below and right here. We're giving one of them away, so it's a great way to get even more out of your router. So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to talk about the types of routers and what they're used for. Routers, like I said, come in all shapes and sizes. Here we have a beast of a router, 3¼ horse plunge base. This is a Bosch Colt fixed base. A lot of these smaller 1/4" collet routers come with lots of different accessories. This Bosch Colt has more accessories than just about anyone on the market, which is one of the reasons I think it's such a great router for the beginner. These big boys here can take the place of these, but they can be very powerful and very heavy. Sometimes I find lots of uses for these little guys, even though I own two of these, one in my router table and one here. These come with both a 1/4" and 1/8" collet, so you can still use all of your bits from this one, as well as all the bigger 1/4" bits. So routers can be used for many things, from mortise and tenon, edge guides, circle cutting, jointing, flattening slab. They can be used for routing templates when you want to do repeatable table legs or chair legs. Really, the uses are endless. So let's talk about how to use them. Routers that are upright are always going to spin clockwise, as you can see by this arrow. Most routers will have an arrow on them. In a router table, when it's upside down, it's going to spin counterclockwise. Now, there's two types of cuts, conventional and climb. Conventional is what you're going to use 99% of the time, and that's when you push against the router bit. And just like a table saw blade is spinning towards you, you're going to push through the cut. Now, this is where reading grain comes into play. Now, here on this piece of mahogany, you can see the grain is going this way off the board. And so if you were to route like this, that bit is going to want to reach under those fibers, grab them, and that's when you get tear out. So that's when you'd want to flip this piece over and route so that the grain was falling off and you were severing it this way. The very rare times that you would use a climb cut is if you had to route this way. Let's say you had a piece that was built and you were doing a round over on the edge and there was just absolutely no way to flip it over and route the other side. Then what you would do is you would route it down, not to its complete depth, and then when you had, just a tiny smidge left, you could do a climb cut. Sometimes with difficult grain, a climb cut is your only option, but 99% of the time you're going to use conventional routing. Another thing that makes routing on a router table much safer is safety pins. And now I also included these in the router jig I just built, the previous video. There are safety pins included. It's a mobile router table that you can flip over. And now with a safety pin, what you would do, if you needed to do, let's say you were flush trimming or doing a round over, what you would do is support your board on the safety pin and then move it into the cut like this, and that gives you more support so that when you touch your board for the first time, you're not just out in the open and it could do all sorts of crazy stuff. Push cutting gives you a lot more control on a router, and the reason that climb cuts are considered more dangerous and used much less frequently is when you're going with the way that a router bit is spinning, it can pull it out of your hand and send it shooting off into the abyss. So when you're cutting, make sure you do conventional cuts, go against your router bit, and always take small passes on a router. Just because this 45-degree chamfer bit has this much cutting capability doesn't mean you would ever want to do that. If I wanted that entire chamfer, I would probably do this in 4 or 5 passes, going up by about 1/4 to 1/2 inch at a time, depending on whether I had a beefcake router or a smaller palm router like this one. Another great little trick when you're thinking about grain direction and you're doing an edge profile is that almost certainly when you're doing the end grade side and coming off the long grain side is going to tear out. So when you're doing edge profiles, you always want to start with your end grain, then go long grain, end grain, and finish with long grain, and that's going to ensure you don't tear out. There's lots of depth adjustments on routers. There's macro and micro adjustments. On all of these, plunge routers, you have the ability to go down by hand. And then what you can do is use something like the stop on a router, which is going to stop it right there. And if you need to just go a little bit deeper, you can unplunge it here and close that up. And that's a micro adjustment on that one. Routers like this Triton router here have the same type of adjustment where you go down like that, and then they have a micro adjust here where you can do very small fractions. They all have stop guides here, like this one, which are great for when you're trying to get a mortise to the exact depth or a tenon sheet cleaned up to the exact depth. Those are great. There's several different types of cutting when you're using a router. There's fixed and freehand. Freehand would be like in the abalone butterfly key video where I was cutting out for the butterfly key before I used my chisels. It would be for like roughing out an area, and basically you get real close to your material, keep both hands on it, and kind of go close to your line as you feel comfortable doing. There's lots of ways to do fixed routing where you line it up with a certain direction. Now on my router jig template that I did, there's an edge guide here, or you can lock it up for a mortise. Another way to do a fence is to clamp a piece of wood directly onto your board. Now the great thing about most routers, some have a square edge, but most of them are round. And so when you clamp a board there, as long as you're the right distance away from your fence, you're always going to be in the same place because it's equal distances all the way around. This is another great example of an edge guide. This is for the Bosch Colt, and it has a really cool micro adjust feature on it where you can just dial in your piece just so it can get exactly where you need it to be. Now when you're using edge guides like this one for the Triton, it has two pieces that are very wide here, which I hate because when you get to the end of the board, it has a tendency to come off and tilt. So what I like to do is screw a piece of scrap plywood to it, which gives you a completely flat edge all the way across and allows you to really keep your board in the correct location without a lot of work. Another great trick for routing in a fixed location, if you needed to cut a groove or a dado like we did in the Mox and Vise video, and you'll see in the Mox and Vise video, I use an edge guide, but if it was in the middle of a piece where you couldn't get an edge guide, you can take two pieces, set them at exactly 90 degrees, and then on a scrap piece of wood, you can take your router, run it through with a straight bit, and that'll give you exactly where that straight bit's going to be as long as you know this is 90 degrees. And then you could make a mark of where you want your groove and you could line that cut up. I think I saw Dustin Penner do it once. I'll link the video where he does. Another way to use a router in a controlled manner is through bushings, and they're great because you can just follow any pattern you want and use a bushing. So let me take you in here. Here's a pattern that I used for the Nakashima shop stool. I did some really great template routing in there. In fact, what I was talking about earlier about uphill versus downhill, this was a really tricky one because one of these would route uphill, one would be downhill, and so we need to keep flipping the piece over and using different bearings. And this is the one for my Bosch Colt. What you would do is you would take a bushing, and this is one with an inside diameter of 1/4 inch and outside diameter of 5/16, so you can calculate exactly where it is you need your piece to be. You would insert it in your router here, use one of these screw-on cones and screw that on. And then one of the things you could use that for is for edge joining. You could take a straight edge and put it right on top of your board so that your bearing would ride on the straight edge and give your piece a very straight edge. It'd be a great way to joint a board. The other thing that these are great for is for inlay. You can do some really, really cool things by hand using patterns and different size diameter bushing. So for example, if you were using an 1/8 inch bit with an outside diameter of 5/16, you could then calculate what bushing you needed to cut the negative and positive of that shape and inlay them. So let's talk about the different kinds of bits you can use. There's basically two types of bits, and that's bearing guided and non-bearing guided, and then it breaks down to different categories from there. There's lots of different edge profiles. These are all roundovers. These are all radius bits. We have chamfer bits, slot cutting bits, flush trim bits, and those are all bearing guided bits. A little trick for bearing guided bits is always make sure that your bearing is tight. If that screw comes off in the middle of a pass with your router, you will ruin your piece. There's then non-guided bearing bits like these straight bits, which very rarely are used freehand. Almost always, if you're using a non-bearing guided bit, you're going to be using some sort of a fence or an edge guide. Now, when you're buying bits, one thing I highly recommend is buy a cheap set like this and then only replace the ones you use. I feel like people have a tendency to just buy lots of things that they don't need. So what I like to do is buy something like this. I think I picked this whole setup for like $100. It's a 1/4 inch collet router bit set. This is the 1/8 inch collet, so you can see the difference in size there. But here are some of the bearings that I've replaced that I use on a regular basis from these kits. That's a chamfer 45-degree bit, which is bearing guided. Lots of different flush trim bits, from little ones like this for doing small areas, bigger ones, and then this beast of a bit. This is by far my favorite bit. It's probably more expensive than all of these put together. This is a white side double bearing bit. And this is so amazing. It cuts in both directions, both up and down. It's got a bearing on the top, a bearing on the bottom. Both of those can be removed. So when we talked about the uphill and downhill example, you could route the downhill way and then flip the piece over and route the downhill way going the other way. This is an amazing bit. It's about 170 bucks. I'll put a link down in the description, but if you're gonna buy any flush trim bit, this is a great one. They also have one for a 1/4 inch collet that's really, really good. This is another inexpensive set that I got for my 1/4 inch router. As you can see, some of them I've really just used and abused, like this straight bit here, this flush trim bit. In fact, the bearing's frozen on that. And those are all the ones that I've replaced. Another great style of bit are these spiral upcut and downcut bits. These are just the best when it comes to straight bits. They're great at removing material and also getting waste out of the hole. So I use these a lot for mortises or for cutting small lines, or if I needed to cut out like a circle, something where I'm going to completely remove material, I'll use these because they really are great at cutting quickly and getting material out of the way. This is a centering cone, and this is what you use when you put on bushings. It can fit in both an 1/8 inch collet and a 1/4 inch collet, and the way it works is you put it in your collet and bring it straight down so that your base plate is completely centered, and that'll allow you to screw on your bushing and know that it's in the direct center of your router. So when it comes to purchasing routers and also bits, I have two pieces of advice for you. One, obviously buy the best one that you can afford. This Triton router is an incredible full-size router because it already comes with a router lift built in. You can save money and put it in a table. Or this Colt is a great router for a smaller size because it comes with so many accessories. It's really powerful. For years I got it all done with a router like this. Comes with all kinds of accessories. You can buy it with the fix and plunge base in a kit. You can get edge guides for it. You can get bushings for it. It does everything that this does, except for it lacks the same amount of power. Both of these have variable speed, and I can highly recommend these two here. When it comes to router bits, my advice is the exact opposite. Start with a cheap set like this one, and then replace the router bits that you wear out or that you use all the time. A set like this is the cost of 2 nice router bits, and so there's no point in trying to buy a bunch of different router bits and some you don't ever use, and then you can get router bits that suit your workflow. So kind of to sum it all up, get the best router you can, replace the cheap bits with expensive bits that you need, route with the grain, go downhill, and go slow. Above all else, stay safe in the shop. Have a wonderful day.